Good evening, everyone. My name is David Hassler, Director of the Wick Poetry Center, and welcome to our 26th annual Stan and Tom Wick Poetry Prize reading, this year featuring Alfredo Aguilar and Judge Natalie Diaz. Tonight, we're celebrating Alfredo's debut first book, On This Side of the Desert, published by the Kent State University Press. And we're thrilled to welcome Natalie Diaz, our judge, with us for the first time to share her poetry. The reading tonight is made possible with grants from the Ohio Arts Council. We're also grateful to our continued collaboration with the Kent State University Press for publishing our National First Book Prize. Tonight's reading and all the programs of the Wick Poetry Center would not be possible without the generosity of the Wick family. Since 1984, Bob and Walter Wick have supported this program in memory of their sons, Stanley and Tom Wick. Well, this is our first venture into a remote online reading after 26 years of our first book prize. And so we will not be having our famous Wick reception afterwards and famous Wick cookies, and a chance for you to purchase the books of our authors and have them sign them. But we encourage you to purchase them online and to stick around after tonight's reading for a Q&A, a chance to leave comments or to ask questions to both of our readers. At this moment, I'd like to ask Natalie to introduce Alfredo, and after his reading, I'll briefly come back to introduce Natalie Diaz. Again, welcome everyone, and thank you.
Great, gracias for having me. You can hear me okay? Yeah, I just wanted to make sure my refrigerator is doing something odd. It's my luck to be with you all tonight, especially to celebrate Alfredo's beautiful book. I'm gonna go ahead and just do a short introduction. Pulled a little bit from my introduction in the book and altered a little bit. Alfredo Aguilar's poems in his book On This Side of the Desert are a lexicon of intimacy. In these poems, we recognize the desert as what it has always been, a body like any other, winning and losing, wounded with desire and scarred with memory, making foot tracks of where it has been and reaching toward what it thirsts for. In this book, as in life, the battle is always with and against the desert. The battle is always for the desert. An inventory where the abacus is often our body and how it keeps and carries what and whom the desert has given and taken from us, of what the desert might give us yet, of touch and thorn, of water and love. In his first poem, I Woke Up in the Wilderness, Aguilar makes clear the stakes wagered in these borderlands pastorals. I'm going to read you a little piece, and this I've carried this image and the images of this poem in particular since I first read what was then a manuscript, Alfredo, and then what has now become this book. I picked a fallen feather off the ground and let it dangle from my ear. I ate a cactus pear, spat out a thimble of silver. The saguaro told me, you can learn to live on the smallest giving, to hold a palm full of water and make it last a season. There's something that ached in me in those lines and still does, that, thinking of the many ways so many of us know the desert and the kind of lives we've been able to build from it alongside some of the things that are usually projected onto the desert. To make a border of any land is to attempt to alter our bodies and our tongues, to sever us from our roots so that we don't bloom into our futures. These poems challenge our spatial ideas of what the borderlands are. Here, borders and lands are reshuffled and remapped as places of haunting and responsibility, also places of desire and fruiting. This desert and the crossing itself in many ways become the center instead of the edges or fringes until we lose track of which side is the right side and the wrong side, which side we left, which we arrived in. Who is us and them And aren't we always all? Aguilar asks again and again in these poems, what does it mean to cross a border, a page, a story, a heartbreak, or a hope? And once that crossing begins, when are we allowed to stop? Is it possible to ever leave the imagination of our childhoods, where many of our first wounds were earned? And is it a luck or a penance to know the pathway back to those wounds so well? If it's true what they say, that our futures are made of our pasts, perhaps we're always walking backward toward everything that is possible. On this side of the desert asks us to consider not only what, but whom does the poet risk when they set their recuerdos onto the table of any electricity-haunted night or terribly sunlit afternoon of writing, to tell a story about what has happened in order to leap toward what has yet to happen. Aguilar is risking at least a family and a language, terrible, beautiful desert of beloveds and strangers. Most importantly, and as he writes in his final poem, Origin Story, Aguilar is risking rising into every morning as light. And I'm going to read just a small section from that. And I realize it's possible, Alfredo, that you're going to read this as well. And I think that's also really lucky that we'll be able to hear probably this more than once. And I'll end on this small section and then turn it over. The child, so desperate to be near those far away, reached into the sky and became smoke. The child who continued to love unbittered by this world became the sun. He rises every morning to cover the earth in light, and look how he has never dimmed. And those lines still give me goosebumps, and they did now. So mil gracias y felicidades, and we get to hear from Alfredo.
Thank you so much for that beautiful intro. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Yeah. Like, thank you so much for your belief in the poem and your generosity in your reading. And thank you to the Wick Center for making the prize possible, and Kent State University Press for publishing the book. Thank you to everyone. There's so many people who've gone to that have made the book possible in a lot of ways. And also, like, thank you for everyone that's like tuning in. Yeah, I mean, thank you for your time, and I'll go ahead and read some poems and maybe talk a little bit in the middle about the book, how it kind of maybe came about. I don't know that I can read for read poems for 25 minutes straight, but yeah, let's start. I'm gonna read the first poem in the book that Natalie mentioned, but yeah, here we go. I woke up in the wilderness and could not tell what time it was. I walked beside you in the dark, and you became a white owl. You flew onto a mesquite branch, turned your head, opened your small noble beak, looked into me, then flew away. I picked a fallen feather off the ground and let it dangle from my ear. I ate a cactus pear, spat out a thimble of silver. Saguaro told me you can learn to live on the smallest giving, to hold a palm full of water and make it last a season. I looked up and the clouds on the moon shivered. I spoke with a coyote. He told me how the world was born. In the beginning, he said, an ocean. He licked my palms clean, told me I howl only to try and call back everything that has left me. I was in reviewing and like rereading the book. I was thinking just how much of the poem is kind of, or how much of the book is populated kind of like by family, and those, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about family, I guess, because in the past 2 years, or 2 years ago, I moved like out of state, and now that we're in a pandemic, it's like I can't even go like visit them, or like that kind of endeavor is super fraught. So probably gonna be a lot of family poems, but yeah, here's one. On a ranch, my father broke horses, found discipline at the end of a whip, punished the wild colt for disobedience. It threw its body on him, flailed and left him covered in a new coat of dust. used rope to force the colt to kneel before him, and it never again tried to jump. My father was shaped by hands that were fatherless, withheld a warmth they did not know how to offer. His own hands grew thick with calluses. He learned berry, learned stone face, and called them strength. The night his mother passed, his voice was a quiet swell. A rope loosened, and unbridled sorrow bucked against the walls of his throat. It rose on its hind legs, nostrils flared. He bit his lip, felt the pull of a metal bar along his tongue, and did not weep. The next poem, let's see. This is just, I guess, kind of about going to my father's hometown, which is about an hour outside of Michoacan, Mexico, which is, the town's called Querendaro. And just, I don't know, it's always kind of, I don't know, it's a very different place from just being like in Southern California, but beautiful. In boyhood, my small fingers curled around a cow's teat. I pointed in the direction of the pail below. I don't want to harm the cow and tug gently. I look up at my father, wondering why there isn't any milk, and he laughs, says, "No hubieran aguantado vivir aquí." He crouches, places his calloused hands on the base of two teats and tugs. Milk shoots out, hisses as it fills the pail. A tail of steam rises from the top. In the house where my father was raised, we drink milk meant for the mouth of a calf. We sit at a table where a thin layer of plastic protects the white lace beneath. Outside, chickens run across the yard. A bag of maize sits in a shed. There are no video games, and the only television set in the house has knobs. Life here is very different from the way you've grown up, my father says. I think what he means is that he was born into work, and I was born into a crib, that he is one of 15 sets of teeth, that he quit his schooling to cut crops, that he lied about his age when trying to find work in the US, said he was 18 when he was only 16. I don't know who my father is without sweat, without his rough fingers, his mustache. I have never seen a single photo of him as a boy. I'm probably going to try to do something a little bit more lighthearted, I guess. This poem, this next one, if I can find it, is, let's see, it's about a haunted house. This is a story that my mother told me, and actually when I recently talked to her, she mentioned it, so it's kind of funny. My mother says her childhood home is haunted, and that one night she overheard the frantic stomp of horse hooves coming from the backyard. Concerned they would escape, she warned her father. When he went out to see, he saw only the horses upright in their sleep, dreaming, but noticed each of their manes had been braided by some phantom hand. Another time, her small dog stood on the rooftop barking, then quickly went silent. She could only hear the wind whistling. The dog disappeared, and a week later returned in a man's arms. He found him in brush, trembling. The dog was thin and cowered as though it had fought something and lost. At the end of that week, his heart stopped. One evening, she and her family were outside talking with neighbors when they heard a lone flute singing from inside their empty house. They looked at one another, and my mother ran back inside to find no one and her flute locked away in its case. She tells me she never drinks water before going to bed, and I ask why. She looks at me, says, "I don't want to get up in the dark, walk to the bathroom, and have something find me." Let's see. Childhood is a realm that language charts like any map. Do you remember, as an infant, your mother bathed you in sugar water? Your father, having returned from work, lifted you up, and you kissed his warm stubbled cheek, then winced because he tasted like the ocean. Here, your parents will only ever be parents. You sat in the back seat singing along to a cassette tape, throwing syllables like fistfuls of rice. You placed a popsicle inside the microwave, said it was too cold. In the garage, you, your little brother, and cousin chanted around a poisonous snake your father had severed with an axe. You plucked a pomegranate off the neighbor's tree and opened it with a bat. Your fingers, teeth, and t-shirt stained sticky purple red. On picture day, it was so warm you took off the button shirt your mother had chose just for you and posed grinning in a white tank top. You danced home from the hospital with your newborn sister, whose name you had won in a coin toss. During a game of hide and seek, your mother whispered, "Hide where we leave the clothes," and you hid inside the dryer. You lay in that curved, dark belly, refused to come out when everyone called your name, and no one ever found you. Let's see, what else? This next poem is sort of about the Lion King a little bit. It's a film that meant a lot to me, or I just like really, really loved, I guess, as a kid. The first time I went to the cinema, I stepped inside a dim theater room, the aisle lit like a runway. I wanted to run down it, my small arms open wide, to fly through the air and be weightless. My little brother picked a row to sit in, and we were small for the cushioned seats. My sneakers dangled above the floor. Dark filled the room, and a small point of light spread into color before us. Like watching a full moon, it felt private, even while viewing with the rest of the world. Sound swelled from the walls, and I felt the frames begin to shake. I covered my ears to keep the world from bursting. The glow from behind me gave way to a landscape on the screen, and I was not where I was sitting. The tiny point of light unrolled an entire savanna before my eyes. A purple sun rose and animals leapt out of a stream. In the movie, before the small lion lost his father in a stampede, he looked down to see a pair of rocks trembling. And I too, small and with a father, feet hung above the ground, looked to the floor, thinking the dark would shake. Let's see. I'm going to read a shorter one, if I can find it. Oh yeah, there it is. A vowel. Everyone I've ever loved split me open and fed me a warm meal after. I was a shell of lime filled with coconut and sugar, cherished on another's tongue. I retreated into my mirror, and everyone I cared for vanished from their portraits. I carried my mother's face, my father's distance. I tried to find a language on my lone skin and make it mine. Find me etching letters into the dirt, attempting again and again to build a home. Let's see. I think maybe this would be a good time to maybe kind of talk about the book, like the poems in the book, mostly how they kind of came about. And I might go about it in a roundabout way by talking a little bit about myself. So I was born and raised in like North County, San Diego, like kind of inland. And I'm currently in Texas, like Central Texas. And years ago, my main creative expression was learning, playing, and writing songs on the guitar. Most of what I learned about like chords and melody was mostly from playing in a church choir that my mom kind of like suggested that we do if I wanted to learn how to play the instrument. My brother played drums and keyboard. I kind of, I guess through that, learned my instrument. And when I became proficient, I was eager to learn songs that I cherished and that meant a lot to me, that I loved. I studied the words, the melodies, and after that was really eager to write my own songs with my own words, with my own voice. For a long time, I really kind of thought of myself as a songwriter with like an eye towards language and lyricism, but I didn't really share anything or like perform, really just kind of stayed within the four walls of a room where I would attempt to record on this very microphone, but was mostly unsatisfied with how things sounded. The songs were okay, I was okay with the songs, but the sound the recording was not, I don't know, I envisioned something else. But I still kind of kept at it. And I really only began performing in front of people when a friend at, during community college invited me to an open mic called Glassless Minds, which is out in Oceanside. So it's a little closer to the coast. I went with the guitar case slung over my shoulder, put my name up on the sign-up list, and just waited nervously for the reading to start. And like before, I was not anywhere near the top of the list because I was just terrified. But I watched the people that were ahead of me read and recite poems, often from like memory, and it was just like kind of blown away by how like, I don't know, like I was like, who memorizes poems? But also just like more than that, it was just like how visceral and like immediate the work that I was seeing and hearing was. It was something I'd never like seen before. Like I'd never watched Def Jam. I wasn't aware of that. I only became of it like Def Jam poetry only. I became aware of that only like not much after. But anyway, when my name was finally called, I was terrified to get up on stage, and I can't say for sure what I played, but I'm pretty sure it was like a Woody Guthrie song. And I shook the entire time. When I finished, some people in the crowd applauded, and or maybe they didn't. I just quickly took my seat. I was just a bundle of nerves, and I just wanted to sit down. After the reading kind of was over, I kind of chatted up with the host, and like encouraged me to like come back and like share more songs. The host himself was a poet, an extraordinary poet. And I would come back, but only every so often. And I sort of kind of through that became familiar with some of the poets who frequented the mic. And at the time I was just taking in all this poetry, all this like live art, but it never really crossed my mind to ever write a poem. I was like, I'm a songwriter. When I began to go to the mic more regularly, like after college, and just like one day out of the blue, found myself thinking in like the cadences and rhythms that I'd like steeped myself in at those readings. And I wrote a poem, like the very, very first one, and shared it on the stage, and got so much encouragement from the people like there and the poets there to just like keep writing and like keep at it. And I did. And those poets would come to include some of my like closest and like dearest friends. We would share poems and talk about like poets that we loved. We gave each other feedback. We went to other readings together and signed up each other on the reading list. Like you're going, like you're reading. We pushed and cheered on one another in our craft. We made space for each other. It was really just such a beautiful time. And I learned not just how to be a poet, but how to be like a person like in the world. I don't know. I feel like it all seems like so long ago, especially now, like pandemic time. And so many of those people, myself included, have moved on, continued writing, taken up some other art form. But when I think about the greatest influence in my writing personally, I think like firstly of very dear and brilliant friends. I don't really think I would have come to poetry in the way that I did were it not for them, for their encouragement and generosity and artistry. There's like in the book, there are so many kind of like seeds or fragments of stuff or like threads. I think that for a long time I had just been like reading out loud. And I think that this work kind of exists, or like my work, I think my art exists in communion with others that are close to me. And it's in that spirit that I would like to maybe share or like make space for some of those people's work, if that's cool. This first, I'm just gonna read like maybe 2 poems, but first poet and poem is a poem by a dear friend, Carla Cordero. And I'll just go ahead and read it. In praise of snow. My sister cuts construction paper snowflakes, takes each piece of artificial winter on cactus petals. She ignores rebellious needles, brushes them off, and claims a December frost in our backyard. Over adobe walls, lizards salivate as ice cubes between our lips tell stories under palm trees. I tell her it's snowing outside. as our mothers and tias gossip, ridiculing the neighbor's daughter who sports snow boots, the chola who got pregnant from a boy twice her age. They giggle and blame the heat. I tell my sister to never have children with a man who sweats too much. I say, drink plenty of water and avoid the city's snowmelt where everything sticks and stays. We make our promise over snow puddles, lay our backs to the cold, waving our arms and legs. We escape an avalanche snowing our way. Now bathed in ice, we smile. Notice ice angels fossiled into the ground and open our eyes. And the second poem is by a poet named Laura Villarreal, and the poem is called Boiling Puffins. Or were they penguins, 3 million boiled into lamp oil, and their beaks sold as children's masks during summer festivals? Listen, I don't know if that last part is true. My mind adds extra details to every story. Like when my dad buys kitchen knives at garage sales, it feels ominous. He says no one can ever have enough good knives. I'm sure people sell used kitchen knives all the time. Serrated blades are a hot seller, am I right? But the year we got a dog, my dad's coworker stabbed his wife until she played dead, and the cops never found that knife, so I worry about the history of everyday objects. I shop at Target since vintage and antique are ways of saying pre-haunted. I get the heebie-jeebies easy. I have goosebumps thinking about the smell of antique promise rings. Listen, I shouldn't be hypocritical. I've told all my lovers my body is full of ghosts, but who hasn't, right? I've told them to please not touch the scar on my thigh. It's from a hunting knife. I've told them antique shop rules apply. You break, you buy. When I'm driving, I begin to wonder about cars and dogs left on the roadside, especially those near lakes and rivers. Would I ever leave mine abandoned like that? I read once that over 500,000 people disappear every year in the US, and there's not enough milk cartons for all their faces because of millennials who ruined the milk and cereal industry. I've heard the mind forgets trauma if it loves its owner enough, but listen, that one probably isn't true. I read it on a message board in 2006. When I can't sleep, I read WikiHows about erasing myself from the internet. It's easier than you would think to leave and never be found. It's easier to start new as someone else sometimes. If someday my car is abandoned by the river, my cell phone vibrating in the knife drawer, would you listen for me late at night putting my key in the door? Would you believe me if I told you I left something important at home and came back, put my head on your chest, and just listened? Yeah, so those, other people are great, friends are great, and I love them all dearly. I'm going to go back to this book, but I really do think that my work, like other people, make my work possible. I'm gonna go ahead and just read some more poems and maybe end with a title poem. But yeah, this one's about teeth. My mother drove us into Tijuana for dentistry because we didn't have American health insurance. Past Otay Mesa checkpoint were billboards in Spanish and narrowed, rutted streets. On our left were rows of cars waiting to enter the US. Our dentist, Ignacio, was a friend of my mother's childhood, and often they reminisced about their small town, folks they knew, folks that had passed. The town looked so different now, how their lives led them here, with my mother leaving the country. I sat in a dental chair and Ignacio mixed putty until it was pink. He needed an impression for my top teeth retainers. I tasted a cold metal tray that kept the mold in place. After a minute, he had wedged it and my mouth smacked of chalk. Before leaving, my mother asked Ignacio about a new denture. The one she had was old. And until that moment, I never knew my mother had false teeth. In our car, in the middle of an expanse of cars, waiting to get back into the US, my mother said, I lost a lot of my teeth when I was young. She removed her top denture, smiled at me, revealed a dark gap between rows of ivory. She tried to say something, and it came out jumbled. She laughed, not covering the gap. Then I laughed with all my teeth, and she pushed hers back into her mouth. I've worn these for a long time. I don't want that for you. From the window, I watched older men push carts between stopped cars. They sold balloons, buy popsicles, aguas, dulces, a currency exchange booth announced all I could buy with just $1 American. I looked at my mother. noticed her denture yellowing at its edges and saw her without it. My mother left, came to America, had crossed for this. Let's see. Let's see. This poem's called Yellow House. Morning rose like a quiver of flutes. From my room, a flagpole, a field of goldenrod, the mountains. I heard door latches in the hallway click into place. I found you kneeling at your bedside, singing into the sheets, lights played on the floor. I lay on a couch playing a thumb piano. You said that every time you looked out the window, you watched me wading into the flower fields, unsure if I would return. In the evening, we stood at the edge of a landscape and I wanted to bottle the dying light. You spoke of your brother, the duty to family. Being a firstborn, I nodded. In that silence, I could hear my own blood whistle, so thin and distant from the soil where I stood. On the porch, you asked, "Who do you sing for?" And I didn't have an answer. You said, "I sing for the dead," then looked at me. You do too. Let's see. I think I'm just going to read a couple more, then pass it off. You watched your father leap into a pool and laugh in disbelief. You never knew he could swim. He treads water, grins, and asks, "No supiste que podía nadar?" He tells you that in his youth, on the warm days leading up to summer, he and some other boys would run down to the river after school, strip, then jump into the water. I haven't swam much since then, he says, but I still remember. It seems too gentle for him. Someone who you believe, or who would have you believe, he was only ever a child of toil. But it's also true that there were moments to dance, to sing, to swim. You imagine that river glistening, your father, a small child, learning how to let the water hold him. About his life, you know only parts. The little he's told you, the stories you hear from family. Like when he set out on a pilgrimage from his small town to the Basilica in Mexico City and prayed to the Virgen de Guadalupe to cure his ailing father. Or when, one night at a dance, he saw your mother for the first time, and after they danced, he gave her a note with his name and number. How can you ask the people you love about their life? You can only wade through hushed water, finding pieces of a portrait imperfect and blue, whispering at the bottom of memory. I'm going to go ahead and read Origin Myth and then read the title poem, and that'll be all for me. Origin Myth. The child who never stopped running grew up to become the wind, left behind their body and its boulders to blow ships across the water and spin the lone weather vane on the barn. The girl who spent days making birds from lightning and clay to feel less alone became a god. There were 1,000 hands reaching to her for an answer, but never her palms. The boy whose grief was too big for his body became the ocean. Everyone knew the shape of his sorrow, and we all thrashed our way out of him after breaking the glass-like surface. The baby, born with holes in their skin, let the breeze weave through their body, let 100 notes rise into the air, and grew up to be a song. The child, so desperate to be near those far away, reached into the sky and became smoke. The child, who continued to love unbittered by this world, became the sun. He rises every morning to cover the earth in light, and look how he has never dimmed. All right, this will be the last poem, and it's the title poem of the book. On this side of the desert, Raul and I drive by a yellow sign that reads, "Cuidado, no exponga su vida a los elementos, no vale la pena." You pass a mountain, we're tucked away in a place that the relentless sun cannot reach. The direction and miles left to the border are scratched into a boulder. Raul tells me that yesterday, under a creosote bush, he found a knapsack holding only a light bulb and a battered Bible, the body nearby, so far from God, the legs consumed by cramps, the skin wrung of its sweat, all the water escaping the body to try and keep it cool, the clothes stitched onto his skin by the sun, last night's full moon, a final Eucharist his mouth could not reach. He had a name, Santos. He also had a wife, or maybe it was a mother, or a sister, or a daughter. The wallet didn't say. We stop at a white crucifix staked into the ground where there are no roads and leave 12 bottles of water in 12 pairs. Raul tells me that he once found an entire skeleton in torn clothes, the sneakers still tied to its feet. On our way back to the otro lado, a flash flood rushes across the road in front of us. We stop, we step out and face it. We leave the truck running, the speakers aching, y volver, volver. Sweat collects at the base of the gold crucifix necklace underneath my shirt. The reins are short, but so heavy, I say. Right, Raul? Nests of Gila woodpeckers poke their heads out of saguaro. I look at their curious eyes. Raul, I say, and the saguaro blooms. I stare back at the flood. I say my mother's name, Cristina, and desert marigolds crack through a boulder. I say my father's name, Martin, and all the novena candles in the bed of the truck are aglow. I say Santos, and in a pair of footprints in the sand, a man is built up from the part of his body that most touched this earth. I say the names of my tias, tios, primos, and a bronzed mass dressed in white rises from the rushing flood. Their backs are turned to me. They wear my family's shoulders. They head north. Before them, the white obelisks marking the line in the ground crumble. Before them, every metal fence parts. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you all.
Thank you, Alfredo, for that lovely reading. Hearing you talk about the origins of how poetry found you, the friends that heard you into speech, their generosity and encouragement makes me think of letting you know that you are now part of the larger and expanding Wick family of poets. And I'm so grateful that Natalie found your manuscript, and now we are honored to have Natalie read tonight, and for the two of you to meet and to be part of this larger family. Natalie Diaz was born and raised in the Fort Mojave Indian Village in Needles, California, on the banks of the Colorado River. She is Mojave and an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian Tribe. Her first poetry collection, When My Brother Was an Aztec, was published by Copper Canyon Press in 2012 and won the American Book Award. Her second collection, Post-Colonial Love Poem, recently published by Grey Wolf Press, was long listed for the National Book Award and was a finalist for the UK's Forward Prize in poetry. Natalie is a 2018 MacArthur Foundation Fellow, a Lannan Literary Fellow, and a Native Arts Council Foundation Artist Fellow. She's been awarded a Bread Loaf Fellowship and the Princeton Holmes National Poetry Prize, a Hodder Fellowship, and is a member of the Board of Trustees of the United States Artists, where she is an alumnus of the Ford Fellowship. She lives in Mojave Valley, Arizona, where she's worked with the last speakers of the Mojave and directed a language revitalization program. A language activist, she is currently the director of the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands and the Maxine and Jonathan Marshall Chair in Modern and Contemporary Poetry at Arizona State University, where she teaches in the MFA program. Something, Alfredo, you said in your reading, that you learn not so much how to be a poet, but how to be a person in the world. And your poetry came through that. I think that is so true of Natalie's poetry as well. And we're thrilled to have her with us this evening and honored to have her read. Please welcome Natalie Diaz.
Gracias for having me. It's really lucky to be a part of this constellation of language and poets and people, that are happening because of the generosity of this Wick Prize. Georgie, David, all of you, and just what we make possible, I think, with poetry. Sometimes we think the poem itself is what does the work, but often it's everything outside of the poem that makes us who we are and helps us to at the same time imagine and invent the worlds that we need to be able to exist in. it was really lucky for me to be even a small part of this momentum that Alfredo's work is building, and it's already come from a momentum, right? Poetry is a beautiful thing that's a stream. We meet it where we meet it, and it's been happening for a long time without us, and it will continue for a long time beyond us. But I think already, Alfredo, what you've just offered me tonight is, and offered all of us who are here, is becoming a small current in that stream of your poetry family. And if anything, poetry has been that for me. It's been a way of building the kinds of families that I need to be able to live in the world, especially as I go farther and farther from home. And it's no surprise to me that the poetry family you described is such an intimate and powerful family. I think you can always tell by the way someone tells a story how many lives they are connected to, how many peoples they are connected to. I think that's one of the true gifts of a storyteller. Yes, we reach the audience out ahead of us, but the gift I think that I'm most compelled by is that you're also carrying all of the interactions and stories, be that family or friends or strangers, with you as you move into the world. So gracias to all of you for even allowing me to be a part again of this very energetic and generous constellation. And Alfredo, the book is incredibly beautiful. It's something I can't wait for my students to read it. They are very excited about bringing you out. So we'll be able to welcome you into our family in some of the ways that you've welcomed us tonight into your family. I'm going to read a few songs. I do have a question. I'm just wondering, and you don't have to answer it right now. We can maybe answer it, later in the conversation, or even, in the chat or some other time. But I'm thinking about you playing in the church choir, and I'm wondering. And you had mentioned that then you were able to play the songs that you wanted to play. But I'm wondering, because I played the piano growing up, and one of the things that I learned it in the church. So what happened was my dad did a job, and he poured some wheelchair ramps for a family who didn't necessarily have the money to pay him for the labor. They could pay for the materials. So my father poured the ramp, and somehow they exchanged, and he pulled up one day after work with a piano in the back of his work truck. And it was like his work truck was like riding so low, right? And my mother was angry because she's like, we can't eat that. I remember her saying that, like, we can't eat this, and also we lived in a cul-de-sac on the res. So it took like our entire neighborhood to come together to get that piano out of the back of the truck and somehow wedge it into our door. So there we were in this cul-de-sac res HUD house with like a giant piano in it, and it was out of tune, and we knew nothing about that, so we were just kind of banging on it. And it was like, I think it was like a year or so before we even found someone who could tune it, and it was this traveling tuner who happened to like stop off the I-40 on his way other places. So I ended up learning the piano from a woman at our church. We went to the Catholic church in town, so off the res, but in town. So she would come over and give us lessons. But one of the songs I loved, when they would sing it, but also that I learned, was How Great Thou Art. And so my aunts on the reservation also learned hymns, because a lot of them were Christianized and practiced both. So we would practice our Mojave funerals and our Catholic funerals. And something they would do is, we have on the reservation, we have what they call a cry house. So and our funerals last evenings. They're not just show up and leave, but you really mourn for days. So what they would have me do is, during the traditional Mojave ceremonies at the cry house, they had like a keyboard. So it was a mobile little like set of keys, and I would have to go play How Great Thou Art for my great grandmother's friends, all these old elder Mojaves. And it used to drive me nuts, because one, I was like really embarrassed to do that, because most of my cousins and friends on the res were not Christian. It was kind of this older crowd. And then my family, because my father was Mexican and Spanish. But anyhow, so when you were thinking that, I wanted to know if there were any songs that you pulled from the church choir that you still kind of go back to, or that still feel like they're spinning in you, that you dragged with you. Because for me, How Great Thou Art is that one. Like as soon as I sit down at a piano now, it's the first thing that wants to come out of my fingers as I'm sitting there. So yeah, so we can.
I could answer that. Yeah, I could go ahead and answer. No, honestly, I think I was like in middle school, like when I started that. So it's all just kind of like, it's so far back. I don't know that any of it has stuck in that way. But I mean, if I heard it, I might be able to follow along, but I don't like, I couldn't do it off the top of my head.
Does your brother still play?
No, he quit a lot. He quit playing his instruments a lot earlier than I have. I still kind of like noodle around a little bit and like learn songs that I might be interested in, but no.
Yeah.
We did play together sometimes. I was like I really wanted to like, I don't know, start like a duo or something, and my brother was not interested. He was it's like, you go ahead.
At ASU play instruments, so I'm always like trying to force them to be in a band, and that's like very kind of old school of me, I think, to be like, hey, you know, we could have an MFA rock band. It would be great. But to our detriment, it might sound like Paul Muldoon's band, and then we'd really be in trouble. Not a very good band. I just want to read a couple poems that I feel like are in conversation in some way with yours, Alfredo, and some of the things that I found in your work. So when I came to the manuscript, right, like I'm always telling my students, call it a book early. You know, you're calling it a manuscript, you mean the chasm between manuscript and book is so great. But some of those poems, when I began to read them and see them put together, I immediately knew this was a book, and it was a book that I would want to read again and again, that I would want to share with people. And some of the constellations of images really spoke to me. You know, the snakes, like, you know, I live in the desert, the snakes, the pomegranate trees, you know, all of the small mentions of water that felt so large and great, and all of the instances of touch. And so I'm going to read just a few poems that for me, the ways I feel they're kind of moving towards some of your work, or, you know, adjacent to or in proximity. I'm just going to read a couple poems that very intentionally engage with light, and also some poems about the brother figure, which for me has been a very impactful, heavy sometimes, and loving figure on my page as well as off my page in my real life. And so one of the things about this book and the couple poems I will read that's very different from when my brother was an Aztec is that I felt that I needed to be attentive and intentional to infusing the poems with light, even when they were heavier or what might be considered darker emotional moments, because I wanted people to still feel what to me still feels like love, while it might also be something painful or hurtful. So I'm just going to read a few in a row. This is the title poem, so very desert, post-colonial love poem. I've been taught bloodstones can cure a snake bite, can stop the bleeding. Most people forgot this when the war ended. The war ended depending on which war you mean. Those we started before those millennia ago, and onward those which started me, which I lost and won, these ever blooming wounds. I was built by wage, so I wage love and worse, always another campaign to march across a desert night for the cannon flash of your pale skin, settling in a silver lagoon of smoke at your breast. I dismount my dark horse, bend to you there, deliver you the hard pool of all my thirsts. I learned drink in a country of drought. We pleasure to hurt, leave marks the size of stones, each a cabochon polished by our mouths. I, your lapidary wheel turning green, mottled red, the jaspers of our desires. There are wildflowers in my desert which take up to 20 years to bloom. The seeds sleep like geodes beneath hot feldspar sand until a flash flood bolts the arroyo, lifting them in its copper current, opens them with memory. They remember what their God whispered into their ribs. Wake up and ache for your life. Where your hands have been are diamonds on my shoulders, down my back, thighs. I am your culebra. I am in the dirt for you. Your hips are quartz light and dangerous, two rose horn rams ascending a soft desert wash before the November sky untethers a 100-year flood. The desert returns suddenly to its ancient sea. Arise the wild heliotrope, scorpion weed, blue phacelia, which hold purple the way a throat can hold the shape of any great hand. Great hands is what she called mine. The rain will eventually come or not. Until then, we touch our bodies like wounds. The war never ended and somehow begins again. And the book has several epigraphs, and this is an epigraph from Mahmoud Darwish, who's a really important poet for me. And I came to poetry so late, so I was mostly an athlete my whole life, and poetry was something that came, later. And so discovering Mahmoud Darwish's work, and then also being able to spend time in Palestine, and to just feel my own land and people as I'm experiencing him telling the stories of his land and people and experiencing that. So this small, and I don't know, one of the ways I think about the epigraphs is that they are also happening, and I wanted to hold them kind of by themselves, but this is from Butterfly's Burden that Fadi Judah translated. We admitted that we were human beings and melted for love in this desert. Bloodlight. My brother has a knife in his hand. He has decided to stab my father. This could be a story from the Bible if it wasn't already a story about stars. I weep alacranes. The scorpions clatter to the floor like yellow metallic scissors. They land upside down on their backs and eyes, but writhe and flip to their segmented bellies. My brother has forgotten to wear shoes again. My scorpions circle him, whip at his heels. In them is what stings in me. It brings my brother to the ground. He rises, still holding the knife. My father ran out of the house, down the street, crying like a lamplighter, but nobody turned their lights on. It is dark. The only light left is in the scorpions. There's a small light left in the knife, too. My brother now wants to give me the knife. Some might say my brother wants to stab me. He tries to pass it to me like it is a good thing, like, don't you want a little light in your belly? Like the way Orion and Scorpius across all that black night past the sun. My brother loosens his mouth, between his teeth throbbing red Antares. One way to open a body to the stars, with a knife. One way to love a sister, help her bleed light. And that, for me, one of the leaps, not so much an emotional leap, but definitely a language and image leap, like a poetic leap, meaning for me, language is one of my sensualities in the world. It's the way I make sense of any world, not simply just in the utilitarian way of saying what I want or need from someone. But I think of it as a kind of touch, something tactile and sensual. And poetry is one of those ways of language. It's not the only way for me. And even though the impacts of poetry are very large, poetry itself is still a smaller part, I feel like, of the many different languages I have. And that's something I feel like I have to try to fight for a lot in the larger poetry world, because sometimes it can become so transactional. And then it also becomes the thing we do. And that's something I'm interested in trying to challenge myself, is that, you know, what does it mean that I teach poetry, you know, and what does that mean of doing poetry versus what I do on the page versus how I live in my every hour. And so for me, something that I'm thinking a lot about always is, what is my practice of language beyond the page? And I was thinking a lot about touch and generosity, the generosity of touch, the generosity of violence. I think we forget a lot about that generosity demands a lot of violence, as much as it also takes of us, that violence takes of us. It also, I think, creates a different space of generosity that maybe didn't exist before. But that's part of some of this new work and in this book, and it's the ways light comes into it. I'm gonna read one other poem, and then I'll kind of just gauge where we're at and see if we want to go into Q&A, because I think one of the greatest things about this is also that, Alfredo, like, your friends and family are out here, and I think it would be great to be in conversation with them about some of this work. So I will, okay. So apparently I'm kind of stuck on the Bible, so, and just, I mean, I guess hearing you read too, Alfredo, I'm thinking a lot about narrative, and there's one of the ways I think about narratives as well is in this particular poem that I'm going to read. It's called "It Was the Animals." I was thinking a lot about a small moment, like how can I take what we might otherwise call a small moment and show the duration of it emotionally, you know, or mentally, or which end up both being, we think the emotional and intellectual and mental are aside from our body, yet our body is the one that shows the marks and the breaks of the toll those things take on us. And this is, there was a, you know, and this, now I can be behind the scenes, but this was a moment that really happened, a very short moment, maybe a couple minutes long, where my brother did arrive at my house and come in, and I just took notes. So there's some language here, and this is one of the ways I've been thinking about narrative, is sometimes we construct the narrative. So I'm very much in control of the lines and the ways that, you know, the way a line or sentence like lays itself out or unravels. But there's some, what I have come to call and think of as disruptions in this poem, because I was taking notes as my brother was here at my house, because I had been writing when he came in, and I just took notes of a lot of the phrases and things. And so where I normally construct what is dialogue, in here it's very raw and just, it's verbatim the dialogue that happened in kind of a patchwork of ways. So I'll read that poem. It was the animals. Today, my brother brought over a piece of the ark, wrapped in a white plastic grocery bag. He set the bag on my dining table, unknotted it, peeled it away, revealing a foot-long fracture of wood. He took a step back and gestured toward it with his arms and open palms. It's the ark, he said. You mean Noah's ark? I asked. What other ark is there? He answered. Read the inscription, he told me. It tells what's going to happen at the end. What end? I wanted to know. He laughed. What do you mean, what end? The end. Then he lifted it out. The plastic bag rattled. His fingers were silkened by pipe blisters. He held the jagged piece of wood so gently. I had forgotten my brother could be gentle. He set it on the table the way people on television set things when they're afraid those things might blow up or go off. He set it right next to my empty coffee cup. It was no ark. It was the broken end of a picture frame with the floral design carved into the surface. He put his head in his hands. I shouldn't show you this. God, why did I show her this? It's ancient. Oh God, this is so old. Fine, I gave in. Where did you get it? The girl, he said. Oh, the girl. What girl? I asked. You'll wish you never knew, he told me. I watched him drag his wrecked fingers over the chipped flowerwork of the wood. You should read it, but oh, you can't take it, no matter how many books you've read. He was wrong. I could take the ark. I could even take his marvelously fucked fingers, the way they almost glittered. It was the animals I could not take. They came up the walkway into my house, cracked the door frame with their hooves and hips, marched past me into my kitchen, into my brother, tails snaking across my feet before disappearing like retracting vacuum cords into the hollows of my brother's clavicles, tusks scraping the walls, reaching out for him, wildebeest pigs, the oryxes with their black matching horns, javelinas, jaguars, pumas, raptors, the ocelots with their mathematical faces, so many kinds of goat, so many kinds of creature. I wanted to follow them, to get to the bottom of it, but my brother stopped me. This is serious, he said. You have to understand, it can save you. So I sat down, with my brother ruined open like that, and two by two the fantastical beasts parading him. I sat as the water fell against my ankles, built itself up around me, filled my coffee cup before floating it away from the table. My brother, teeming with shadows, a hull of bones lit by tooth and tusk, lifting his ark high into the air. And what do you think? Should we do questions, or how do you feel, Alfredo? Yeah, I think we probably have a bunch out there. I see a lot of cheering happening. So.
So we can receive questions through the chat, and people can also raise their hands, which is a function on Zoom.
You can do like thumbs up and hands and all these strange things. I once put a thumbs up and left it sitting through the whole meeting because I didn't really know how to take it down. So.
Georgie, can we put both Alfredo and Natalie side by side on the screen? I know we have some students at Kent State who definitely have some questions and some comments.
Yeah, Alfredo, do you have family, like blood family in the audience, or?
I think my cousin is watching on YouTube live.
Okay.
Or something like that.
Distant.
Yeah. I think it's also the time difference too. I have a friend who was like, it's at 7 Eastern time, right? And that's 4 o'clock Pacific time, right? And I was like, yeah.
Yeah, now the time changed. So I'm in Arizona, so we don't change. Everybody else
Yeah,
does.
right.
You probably get the question a lot, Alfredo, but I mean, and I get it a lot too, but what are some of the ways you've navigated writing about family? Or like, you had mentioned even that the flute, and thinking about that poem that you said your mother had mentioned some of it the other day. And my family is like very much a haunting family. My mom tells ghost stories that really frighten me, like, because there's something a lot more real sometimes about the supernatural than what we would call kind of reality. But what are some ways that, I mean, have you had any conversations with your family about some of what's in there, or have they kind of been along the journey the whole way?
It's a little bit of both. I think my mom brought up that story and I was like, I think one day she just like brought up the house that she grew up in, which she had visited multiple times before. It's like, oh yeah, that place is haunted. And I was like, what do you mean it's haunted? And she went ahead and kind of told me that story. And I was like, well, that ghost doesn't sound like malevolent. It just sounds pretty benign, but you never know.
Yeah.
We do have two questions in the chat and one in the Q&A. And Shannon McMaster, Natalie, asked a question to you, I was wondering, she says, if you could speak more to this idea of a manuscript and a book feeling like such different things.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, and I think Alfredo, you
Alfredo,
might
too.
also, because you're so close to this leap. You know, one, I think it's a little bit absurd that we call it a manuscript because it is not handwritten. So I'm very much into etymology, and I think a lot about the hand. I think a lot about touch and texture. Even now, we're in digital space, which implies a kind of touch, right? We're talking about fingers in some way, and also thinking about technology. We tend to hold it so far away from the body and the self, when really, I mean, the hammer is a technology. To make a mark is a technology. I think a footprint, in a way, is a type of technology. It's the body, the body marking itself in some way, or the body just announcing its presence. I think in a way, I mean, yeah, I'm in the land that, like, I'm coming to you from Makava or Mojave Valley. So this is where one of my tribes is from here. So I look out north and it's my creation mountain. If I look south, I see where we go in the next life. So it's really easy for me to say this here that might not translate on the other side, but I think my human flesh body is in some ways a technology or an imagining of the land and the water, and so I think about manuscript in that way. One is that we've held it away from ourselves. Like when we do write things out, and I mean, I also know that there are people with different sensualities than I have. So people who wouldn't necessarily write, or who make, language in a different way. But for me to write something and to mark in that way, like in my notebook, for example, and I take constant notes. So even as you're reading, Alfredo, like I have lines here, even though I have your book and I have the manuscript, I'm still writing out lines. It's just the way I make sense of things. I have to be kind of moving. But I feel like there's a way that we've put a power structure on the manuscript or the book. And there's also this kind of an absurd thing. My students and I talk a lot about this, in that the only time you will ever encounter the 8.5 by 11 inch paper is in that, quote, manuscript process, or when you're turning things in or submitting them. So I'm always like giving my students different sizes paper and things, because I want them to know, like, the book is just one way of language, right? And it's a lucky way, because it means that we can, we can print it, we can reiterate it and get it into many people's hands. But I try to kind of pull that power structure apart a little bit for my students, because there's something about the manuscript as it not being necessarily present until it becomes the product of the book. However, it's such a valuable space, and maybe because the book becomes the product, it's still that, I feel like if we would just treat the manuscript as maybe the place where we're still most ourselves, not the place that's just not quite arrived at what it's supposed to be. Because that manuscript space is still where you're a little bit afraid, and you're still trying to force yourself to take leaps, and it's that unknown space. But for me, I tell my students that, like, because of that hierarchical relationship, I try to tell them to think about, like, if this is something you want people to read, then let's just assume it's already a book, it's already in their hands. And it doesn't mean it can't change or shift, but it's alive. That language is already alive and on the page. And I mean, Alfredo, you're much closer to that exact moment with submitting the manuscript, especially considering a prize, and then it becoming a book. So I'm not sure what you think about that question. And then I don't know, David, I think you all definitely have a relationship to that as well. So.
Absolutely. Alfredo, did you want to comment on that? Or we do have another question that from Isaiah Hunt, who is eager to turn his camera on and audio and ask it himself. But Alfredo, I defer to you.
Yeah, I'll just touch on the manuscript thing really quickly, just because I don't know. It's a really interesting kind of question or like thing to consider. I kind of tend to write like in poems. Like I think for a long time, um, I was writing poems, but I didn't really think about them like as a collection until a friend of mine was just like, hey, like you need to put these poems together because I feel like you have a book, like a manuscript. And so it was someone else outside of like, who was like a dear friend, but like also knew about what I was writing that was like, hey, like you need to go ahead and do this. But I think, I don't know. I mean, I was sharing a lot of those poems. So I think there was, maybe it's in the act of sharing, I think that with others that I think that leap is, but I don't know. I think that's all I have to say about that.
Great. Well, I would love to call on Isaiah to turn his camera on and audio and
Yes.
ask his question.
Yeah. Can you see me on my camera? I have my camera on. Okay. Hi, Alfredo. Hi, Natalie. I just want to say I really enjoyed your poems tonight. One thing that I really noticed in all your poems is that they have really great, precise endings. And I know that possibly, I know that what I struggle with in poetry and probably what a lot of other poets do is knowing when a poem is like finished, like when it's absolutely done, rather than trying to, either add more or trying to take things out and such. So I'm just curious, what's your kind of personal taste? Like, how do you, I guess, look at a poem after you're finished with it or after you're finished editing and just like have that knowing or that sense of like, okay, this is finished, it's ready to go out, or it's ready to be part of my manuscript, things like that. So I'm just curious about the process of that.
Yeah, with regards to like endings, I feel like more often than not, or at least it's strange. I think sometimes I have an ending in mind, and then sometimes the writing of the poem is like, how do I get there? That's not always the case, but I feel like that's like I have like, this is where I want to end, and I'm just kind of like building towards that. But sometimes in that building, what happens is that the ending is somewhere else, or I discover that the ending is somewhere else. Okay, and that's the question of when. I don't know when something is ready. Like, I guess if I think time helps definitely with me when I know something is ready, because I know even sometimes like when reading stuff I'll like skip over words or like maybe change it a little bit. It's always, I don't know, it's such a cliche, but I mean, like a poem is never dead or whatever. But I think even in like singing a song or like performing a song, it's like different like every time. Even though the words might be the same or the melody might be the same, it's sung differently. And I kind of think about it like that a little bit. So it's always kind of in revision a little bit, or like you can read it differently, I guess. Did that kind of answer the question?
No, that definitely answered it. I really like how you kind of compared it with a song too, where you're saying like it is different each time that you sing it. I really did like that comparison.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. And it's coming from Mac, and then Deborah Lynn Hook chimed in to say this question resonated with her as well. So maybe we get two with one here. I'm going to read this question from Mac. First, she says that she really loved your reading, Alfredo, and would love if you could elaborate more on how your personal story has been affected by family. This concept is intriguing to her, to hear how other people and how they experience it, as though trying to figure this out. Not only how family influences our personal stories, but how distance and time affect us as well. And so I think both of your readings tonight, yours and Natalie's, touch on this. And I wonder, Alfredo, if you could respond in some way to talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good question. I'm kind of like trying to think through it. I don't know. I think for very early on, and I think even still to some degree, one of the great kind of impulses, I guess, in my writing was to kind of create like a familial kind of history where one wasn't present. And so I would sometimes like just listen very carefully to stories that my parents, tios, uncles, aunts were telling, and just taking an interest in it. And also just like asking like straight out, although that's sometimes very, very difficult. I find that's difficult. It's like, how do you ask people about that? But yeah, I mean, I don't know that that either of my parents have been like, or like people that I ask in my family are like resistant to it, or like they don't seem to mind all that much, from what I can tell. But I feel like there's this distinct memory I have of, I think I was asking my dad about something and he was like, "Are you gonna write about this?" And I was like, "I mean, maybe, I don't know." And he seemed okay with it, but he just seemed curious. He was just like, "Why are you asking me all these questions? You gonna write something about this?" But yeah, that's kind of all I have.
Natalie, would you care to comment on that?
So I guess, I don't know, thinking about how family, I think they use the word influences. I think their influence happens in two places that are not necessarily the poem or the poem making. So they happen in some of what Alfredo was talking about, is like the story, right? Like it's in the happening. You know, what are the things that occur or take place within familial relationships or sites, like in the home or at the party or in the barbecue or at church or, you know, at the wedding. What are the things that happen which are very different than the way we tell about those things? So you had mentioned, like, does time change these? And I think this happens always with language, and especially with family, because we have a lexicon of truth. We all have these lexicons of truth. I don't use the word truth very often, but for clarity with this, every family, I think, has a lexicon of truth and a lexicon of the imagination or exaggeration. You know, I think even like the ghost story that you were mentioning, Alfredo, or like the ways I remember things that hurt me, though the other people involved who were not hurt in that way don't remember it that way. This is a kind of an interesting anecdote, is that when my first book came out, when my brother was an Aztec, there's the brother, or my brother is the way I refer to the character in the book, who is very much an imagining of my, Natalie, relationship with my brother Richie. However, as I'm writing, I never bring Richie onto the page, but I bring a kind of character of what has happened. But after that book came out, my family had never heard me read and didn't really engage in poetry or the fact that I was a writer. I'm an athlete at home. I'm a language revitalist and linguist at home, but I'm not necessarily a poet. But so the press always sends you like your first two books. They're hot off the press, right? And they sent two books to my house, and I gave one to my little brother because my little brother is on the cover of my first book. And he was very proud of it because he doesn't have a shirt on, and he's borrowing a friend of ours who they're dancers, and so they had one of the headdresses. And so I just gave him a copy of the book, and I still felt not sure what to do, that I had a book. Like, what does this mean? You know, and in some ways, Alfredo, you were saying like, well, this is just every time I share them, that's what the poems do. I'm sharing it with people. So seeing it as a book, in some ways, there was something concretizing about the poem that I had never seen the poem so still before, as it was sitting there in my book. But I learned later that evening that I'm from a small town, and my entire family was gathered about 3 houses down the street at my little brother's, the one who was on the cover. So of course they had the book, they were passing it around. And my family in some ways are very, very verbal and verbose and expressive, and in other ways are very secretive and don't want to, you know, very avoiding. but they passed the book around. Nobody read anything out loud. And, you know, I feel like I had a sister who wrote me and was like, quoted a couple lines of images from the poem, was like, I hope you weren't talking about me. And then I had these were the two moments that for me, I think answer what this question is asking about. Not an answer in like a solution, but an answer in the ways I've related to it, is that of course my family was drinking. So it was about, you know, 11 in the evening. I started getting text messages through the night and some into, you know, after midnight. But one of my little brothers, and this definitely like pierced me in a way. My little brother's name is Valentin, and he texted me and he's like, what do you mean? Do you mean that you wished Richie, who's our real life brother, is dead? And that hit me like in a way that I'd never felt what I'd written about, much less what I'd experienced in that moment. And it took poetry to hurt me in that way, in ways that I hadn't been hurt in real life, which I think is interesting. And I don't know what poem he read, but, you know, I'm imagining it was No More Cake Here. And then the next morning, my mother came over, which is unusual for her to just kind of arrive unannounced, because she lives across the river and I live on the Arizona side and she lives on the California side. But she came over quite early, and she had my youngest sister with me. And she said, she was kind of pacing, and I said, Mom, you know, why don't you just sit down and just tell me what's in you? Like, what is it that you want to say? And she finally sat down, and the first thing out of her mouth, she said, it's just that it didn't happen that way. And immediately my little sister immediately responded to my mom in a very kind of like defensive way. And she's like, what do you mean, Mom? That's exactly how it happened. And I still don't know what either of them meant, but what it showed me is that I am writing either toward or away from something in every poem probably, and guessing and wondering or remembering, all incorrectly, in terms of that language is imprecise, right? It's an estimation of our bodies. It is not our actual bodies. But what I realized in that moment is that what my mom sees in those poems is her experience of those moments. So what my mom saw in my poems, which was a hurtful thing, is she saw her failures. She felt things probably like guilt and shame and fault. Whereas my little sister saw, probably for the first time, a language, because in my family, we don't say certain things about what's happened. We just kind of move on. So she probably found a kind of language that let her say it. Not probably exactly how she experienced it, but at least something spoken that to her could feel like it's something had been revealed, where we normally hide some of those moments. And so, you know, I'm of course talking about poems that are about like darker moments. You know, I think one of the things I think I love, Alfredo, in your work as well is there's always a kind of celebration happening also. You know, like it's almost as if we've arrived post-celebration or pre-celebration to something, or that there's still this kind of abundance beneath even some of the younger boy or some of the relationships with the father. There's a kind of abundance of emotion. But that's a very long-winded answer, but I feel like when people ask questions about family, I never like to skip through them, because I know the stakes of writing about family for me, and they feel quite large. So anyway, that's a generous question for me to kind of think toward, and I'll shut my trap now.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Alfredo. We will not read more. We have many more questions, but we won't read them. But instead, we want to come to a close tonight and share with both of you and with our audience two beautiful posters that have been designed by Kent State students. Jessica Miller did a poster for you, Natalie, designing your poem Desire Field, from the Desire Field. And Sebastian Giraldo designed Alfredo's poem Mexico, Denik Titlan. And Georgie has posted these two beautiful posters on the screen. Normally we give these as gifts at your reading as postcards to all the attendees and to you as posters, and we will certainly mail them to you. This is a great way that we love to honor the writers who come to our campus, and it's part of a large project we call Traveling Stanzas. So they hope that they'll travel far, just as your words tonight have traveled in very far to so many of us, and sort of built this community in this little hour and a half here. So thank you both. Thank you all for tuning in to this reading. And we will be in touch, and we hope that you will continue to check out offerings we have at the Wick Poetry Center and online events. We have a student scholarship reading called Celebrating Our Own coming up in just about 2 weeks, right after the Thanksgiving break. You can find out information and registration for that event on our events.travelingstanzas.com page. So thank you again, Natalie, and thank you, Alfredo.
Yeah, gracias.
Thank you for having us.
Gracias too to Jessica for that beautiful broadside. So I appreciate it. And felicidades otra vez, Alfredo. Beautiful
Gracias.
book. Yeah, I'm excited to see, you know, and to watch all the places it goes. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.